The corridor outside the war chamber smelled of beeswax and old iron, and Yvain had walked it 100 times before without ever once being afraid. Tonight, her bare feet made no sound against the polished black stone. She held a silver tray in trembling hands, a porcelain teapot rattling softly against 2 cups she had filled herself in the kitchens below. Chamomile and crushed valerian root, the blend Caloran always asked for when the council kept him too long past midnight. She had been the one to teach it to him, in another life, when she had been only the herbalist's apprentice, and he had been only a man with too many shadows behind his eyes. That had been before the claiming bite, before the secret promises whispered into her hair in the hour before dawn, before the night 4 months ago, when he had pressed his palm flat against her stomach and breathed that he could already feel the small, miraculous heat of what they had made together. Yvain paused at the bend in the corridor, one hand drifting unconsciously to her belly. Beneath the loose linen of her servant's tunic, the curve was beginning to round. Not enough that anyone would notice yet beneath layered skirts. Enough that she felt it every time she breathed. She had come tonight to tell him. 5 months of hiding the secret. 5 months of nausea swallowed in stairwells and tight bodices laced over a body that was changing whether the world was ready or not. 5 months of waiting for the right night, the right moment, the right silence in which to say the words she had practiced 1,000 times in the dark of her tiny chamber. I am carrying your child, Caloran. The bond has given us a son, or a daughter, or perhaps something neither of us can yet imagine. She had been ready to say it tonight. She had braided her hair the way he liked, had worn the small obsidian pendant he had once pressed into her palm and called a marriage stone in everything but name. And then she had reached the war chamber door, and she had heard the voice on the other side that was not her king's. A woman's voice, cold as river ice, edged with something cruel and patient and old. You disappoint me, Alpha, the woman was saying. I came here in good faith. I offered terms a wiser king would have taken on his knees. Caloran's voice answered, low and dangerous. You came here to threaten what is mine. Do not mistake my patience for fear. Yours. The woman laughed, and the sound was a knife drawn slowly from a sheath. Tell me, Caloran Draventh, does your little herb girl know what walks beneath your skin when the council is not watching? Does she know how many women have worn her place before her, and how many are buried in unmarked graves beneath this very castle? Yvain's breath stopped in her throat. Watch your tongue. Or what? You will tear it from my mouth? The woman's voice softened into something almost tender, and that softness was the most terrifying thing Yvain had ever heard. I have studied you, Alpha. I know your every weakness, and I know about her. The girl from the herb gardens. The one whose name you whisper in your sleep. The one carrying a piece of you in her womb that should never have been allowed to take root. The tray nearly slipped from Yvain's hands. The corridor tilted around her. The candle sconces wavered in their iron brackets. She pressed her shoulder hard against the stone wall to keep herself upright. How? How could this woman know? If you touch her, Caloran said, and his voice had dropped to something no longer quite human. I will burn every standing stone of your house to ash. I will hunt every bearer of your blood until there is no one left in this world who remembers your name. Pretty words, but pretty words do not protect a girl who walks alone in the gardens at dusk. I have agents inside these walls, Alpha. In your kitchens, in your stables, in your bedchamber. One word from me, and your little secret bleeds out before the morning bell. Name your terms. You know my terms. End the bond. Send her away. Take my niece as your queen, and I will forget I ever knew the herb girl existed. Refuse, and I promise you, by every god still listening, that you will find her cold before sunrise. The silence that followed was the longest of Yvain's life. She wanted to push the door open. She wanted to scream. She wanted to drop the tray and run, But her body had become something distant and unfamiliar, a thing made of stone and held together only by the wild, hammering insistence of her heart. "Say no, my love. Say no. Tell her you would burn the world for me. Tell her what I am to you." "She will never leave me," Kaloran said. The words were quiet, steady, absolute. And in them, Yvain heard a sentence different from the one he had spoken. She heard a man so certain of his ownership that no threat could rattle him. She heard a man who had not denied a single word the woman had said. Many women had worn her place before her. Many were buried in unmarked graves. She heard a man who, when given the chance to defend her, to claim her, to declare her his queen and his mate, and the mother of his unborn child, had answered with 3 flat words that sounded less like love and more like a deed of property. As if she were a thing he had bought. As if she were a hound that did not know to run. The teapot rattled against the porcelain cups, and Yvain moved before she could think. Before whatever woman stood inside that chamber could open the door and find her there with her trembling hands and her treacherous, betraying belly. She turned on the balls of her bare feet. She walked. Then she walked faster. Then she was running. The tray clutched against her chest, the chamomile sloshing dark stains down the front of her tunic. She did not stop until she reached the eastern stairwell. She did not stop until she had climbed 3 flights and locked herself inside the small servants' alcove where the laundresses stored their baskets. She set the tray down on a folded sheet. She pressed both palms flat against her mouth. And then, finally, she let herself break. The sob that tore from her was silent. She had learned long ago to grieve without sound. She slid down the cold stone wall until she was sitting on the floor with her knees drawn up to her chest, and inside her the small, impossible weight of his child kicked once, very lightly, as if to remind her that she was no longer only herself. Many women had worn her place before her. How many had stood in this same alcove, weeping the same tears, learning the same lesson? She pressed her hand against her belly until the tremor in her fingers stopped. "Watch me," she whispered into the dark. Outside, a bell told the 2nd hour past midnight. Snow had begun to fall against the high windows of the alcove, the first true snow of the season, soft and patient and merciless. Yvain watched it through the warped glass, and she began, with cold and methodical hands, to plan how she would disappear. She did not go to her chamber. She knew with the clarity of a woman who had already been dead in someone else's mind for several minutes, that her chamber was the first place anyone would look. If the woman in the war chamber had agents in the kitchens and the stables, she had agents on the servants' floor. She went, instead, to the still room. It was empty at this hour, banked fires throwing long red shadows across the rafters and the hanging bundles of dried lavender and yarrow. She moved through it with the practiced silence of someone who had spent half her life in this room. She took only what she needed: a small leather satchel, 2 clean linen wraps, a pouch of dried ginger root for the sickness, a bundle of willow bark, a vial of the sleeping draught she had brewed last spring, strong enough to drop a grown man for a full night. 3 silver coins from the tin where the master kept his market money, and a rough note left in their place. "For value taken. I will repay." She paused at the small chest beneath the still-room window. Inside it lay a book. The only thing in the world that was truly hers. Her grandmother's journal, written in a slanting, half-faded hand, recipes and sketches and the names of women whose blood had run in Yvain's veins for 9 generations before her. Her mother had given it to her on the morning she had been sent into service at the castle. "Keep this hidden," her mother had said. "There are things in these pages the Alphas would burn the world to find." She lifted the journal from the chest and pressed it against her belly, and made a quiet promise to a daughter or a son she had not yet met that whatever lived in these pages would belong, one day, to them. The eastern postern gate was guarded by a single sentry on cold nights. an old soldier named Bren, who had a bad knee and a soft heart, and a deep love of the spiced cider Yvain sometimes brought him from the kitchens. She brought him spiced cider tonight too, in a clay flask, and she had stirred something into it with a long copper spoon. She waited in the dark of the gatehouse arch until his head began to nod. She waited until the flask slipped from his fingers. She waited until she was certain he was only asleep, his breathing slow and steady and warm. She knelt and pressed a kiss to the crown of his white head. "Forgive me. I will pray you wake." Then she lifted the iron bar, eased the postern open, and stepped out of the castle of Caer Drevent for the last time in her life. The snow had thickened. It came down in slow, drifting curtains, and within 100 steps her tracks were already softening behind her. She pulled the hood of her cloak low. She kept one hand pressed protectively against her belly, where the child she had not yet been allowed to name was the warmest thing she carried. She did not turn back to look at the high black towers behind her. She only walked, and the snow came down, and the night swallowed her like a stone dropped into a lightless lake. Far above her, in the highest tower of the keep, a figure came at last to a window with its hands pressed flat against the glass. The figure stood very still, head tilted as if listening for a sound that no longer came. A slow, terrible understanding broke across that face. Then the figure turned without a word and began to run. By the time the howl tore from the highest tower of Caer Drevent, a sound so raw and broken that the wolves in the kennels below answered it with a chorus of grief, Yvain was already a mile beyond the outer walls. She did not hear it. She had pressed her hands over her ears against the wind, and she was singing, very softly, a lullaby her grandmother had taught her, and she did not stop until the dawn came up gray and pitiless over a road she had never walked before. 3 months passed. The village of Ash Hollow sat at the bottom of a long forested valley 300 miles south of Caer Drevent. It was a place of slate roofs and crooked chimneys, of an old stone bridge over a fast green river, of women who carded wool on their porches, and men who came home smelling of sawdust and pine. It was a place where a stranger could arrive in the dead of winter, give a false name and a sad story, and be left politely alone to grieve in peace. Yvain had given the name Mirelle. She had given the story of a young widow whose husband had died in a logging accident in the north, who had walked south until her shoes wore through. The village elder, a stooped woman named Goodwife Penn, had looked at her swollen belly and her hollow eyes and her cracked, frostbitten hands, and had said only, "We have an empty cottage at the edge of the orchard. The roof leaks. If you can mend it, you can have it." Mirelle had mended the roof. She had mended a great many things in the 3 months since. She had set the broken wrist of the miller's youngest boy. She had brewed the cough syrup that pulled old Tommen through the worst winter of his life. She had delivered 3 babies, 2 calves, and a foal. The villagers, who had at first spoken to her with the careful courtesy reserved for grieving strangers, now spoke to her with the easier warmth reserved for their own. Goodwife Penn, who was not a woman given to softness, had taken to leaving small wrapped bundles of bread and salted butter on her doorstep without explanation. Mirelle accepted these kindnesses with a quiet gratitude that hid the truth. The truth was that she did not sleep. She lay every night on the narrow cot, her hand resting on the great curve of her belly, and she stared at the rafters and listened. For hoofbeats on the road, for a knock at the door, for a voice she would know in the dark of 1,000 years. The mark on her hip had not faded. This was the thing that frightened her most. Among wolfkind, a claiming bite was supposed to dissolve when the bond was broken. The mark should have gone gray within a fortnight, leaving only smooth skin and the dim ache of memory. Instead, the mark had grown darker. It pulsed beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. It burned when the wind blew from the north, and sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, she could swear she felt something through it. a great searching presence that pushed against the edge of her awareness like a hand against a locked door. She refused to think about what it might mean. She did not allow herself the cruelty of hope. He had let her go because he had never truly held her. That was what she told herself every night, when the mark burned and the great presence pressed against her awareness, and her child kicked beneath her ribs as if reaching for something she could not give. The child was the reason she rose every morning. The child was due by her best reckoning in 2 months. Goodwife Penn, who had a wise woman's eye for these things, had pressed a hand against Yvain's belly only yesterday and frowned. "You carry low, child, and large. Have you considered there might be more than one in there?" Yvain had laughed and shaken her head and changed the subject. She could not bear the question. She walked home that afternoon along the orchard path, the late winter sun thin and silver through the bare branches of the apple trees, when she heard the sound. A low, broken whimper. It came from the shadow of the hedgerow at the edge of the orchard. She stopped on the path and listened. The whimper came again, weaker, and beneath it she heard the labored, wet rasp of something breathing badly. She set down her basket and approached the hedgerow with the careful slowness she had learned from the master herbalist long ago. The slowness one used when approaching wounded creatures who might still have teeth. She knelt at the base of the hedge and parted the brittle winter branches with her fingers. A wolf lay in the snow. It was young, not yet fully grown, its silver-gray coat matted with frozen blood along one flank. A long, ragged tear ran from shoulder to hip, the kind of wound made by a blade rather than a beast. Pale gold eyes were half-lidded, dim with pain and exhaustion. And yet, when it saw her face appear through the branches, it did not snarl. It did not bare its teeth. It only looked at her, and then very slowly, very deliberately, lowered its head until its muzzle rested against the snow, a gesture of submission. A gesture, Yvain realized with a slow, cold dread, that no wild wolf would ever make. Her mark flared once, sharp and sudden, against the curve of her hip. She drew in a slow breath. "Who sent you?" she whispered. The wolf did not answer. Its pale eyes held hers, and there was something in them that was not animal, something patient and intelligent and grieved. And Yvain felt the world she had so carefully built around herself in Ash Hollow tilt very gently on its hinges. She had 2 choices. She could leave the wolf to die in the hedgerow, walk home, bar her door, and pretend she had seen nothing. Or she could heal it. She knelt for a long time in the snow, with one hand resting on her round belly and the other hovering above the wounded animal's flank. She thought of the woman in the war chamber who had laughed like a knife being drawn. She thought of the unmarked graves. She thought of the words, "She will never leave me," and of what those words had cost her. Then she pressed her palm, very gently, against the wolf's wounded flank. "If you have come to find me, tell whoever sent you that the herb girl is dead. Tell them Morel of Ash Hollow lives here now. I have nothing left to give." The wolf closed its eyes. A single tear rolled from the corner of one pale eye and froze in the fur of its muzzle before it fell. And in the orchard behind her, very faintly, Yvain heard the soft crunch of a boot in the snow. She was no longer alone. Yvain did not turn. She kept her hand pressed against the wolf's flank, kept her breathing slow, and let her eyes drift to the small pruning knife on top of her basket 3 feet away in the snow. It was barely the length of her little finger, but it was sharp, and it was iron, and she had learned in 3 months of living alone at the edge of a forest that a frightened woman with a small sharp thing in her hand was a different creature from a frightened woman with empty hands. The footstep crunched again behind her. Closer. "Don't reach for the knife," a voice said. It was a man's voice, low, tired. There was nothing threatening in the tone, which made Yvain's spine go colder than the snow beneath her knees. "I am not going to hurt you. I have been following the wolf for 3 days. If I had wanted you dead, healer, I would have let you bleed out in the orchard with him." The wolf, beneath her hand, let out a small whining breath. Its pale eyes opened, found the man behind her, and closed again as if in relief. "Step where I can see you," Yvain said. The man stepped slowly around the side of the hedgerow. He was not what she had expected. She had expected one of the king's guard, leather and black wool, and the silver wolf's head clasp of Caer Draventh. The man who stepped around the hedge was none of those things. He was old. Not ancient, but old enough that his close-cropped beard was almost entirely gray, and his weathered face had the deep lines of a man who had spent 40 years outdoors in every kind of weather a kingdom could throw at him. He wore a traveler's coat, brown and salt-stained, and a soft wool cap. A heavy walking stick was braced in one hand. The other hand was held open at his side, palm up. His eyes were the giveaway. A deep amber, almost gold. The eyes of a wolf in human skin, rimmed with the red of long sleeplessness and quiet weeping. "My name is Halric. I have served the Draventh line for 41 years. I have come a very long way to find you, Lady Yvain." The use of her real name struck her like a slap. She felt her hand close hard around the wolf's silver fur. She felt the mark on her hip flare with a sudden white-hot pulse. She felt her child kick once, sharp, against the inside of her ribs as if the small unborn creature had recognized the name of its own bloodline being spoken aloud for the first time in 3 months. "That is not my name. It is the only name you have ever had that mattered. Morel is a kindness healer. It is not a person." "How did you find me?" "Slowly and badly. The king has had wolves and riders and trackers searching for you since the morning he found your bed empty. He sits up in the highest tower of Caer Draventh and watches the road. He does not believe you are alive, and he does not believe you are dead, and the not knowing is killing him faster than any blade ever could." Yvain made a small, broken sound she had not meant to make. "You are lying," she whispered. "I have lied for 41 years in service of my king. I am very good at it. I would know if I were doing it now." Halric came another careful step closer and lowered himself stiffly to one knee in the snow, so that his eyes were level with hers. "Whatever you heard in that corridor 3 months ago, you did not hear all of it. You did not hear what came before. You did not hear what came after." The mark on her hip burned so hard she nearly cried out. "You don't know what I heard." "I do. I was on the other side of that door." The world tilted. "You were in the war chamber." "I was. So was the king. So was a woman who came to us under a borrowed name and a false treaty. She had threatened your life and the life of your child not 5 minutes before you arrived with the tea. The king said she will never leave me because if he had said anything that sounded like fear or love, she would have walked out of that chamber and given the order. We were trying to buy you a night, long enough to move you somewhere she could not reach. He went to your chamber an hour later to tell you everything, and he found your bed empty, and a sleeping draught in the gate warden's flask." Yvain could not breathe. She had built her whole new life on a sentence she had only half heard. "I have served 3 alphas in my lifetime, child," Halric said. "The thing you love most is the thing the world will use against you. The only way to keep you safe was to make you sound." To that creature in the chair across from him, like a thing he had counted and weighed and was certain of. He was wrong to do it. He has known he was wrong every hour since. But not because he did not love you. Because he loved you so much he forgot you were standing close enough to a door to hear. A sob tore loose from Yvain's throat before she could stop it. She bent forward over the wounded wolf and pressed her forehead against the rough silver fur of its shoulder, and her tears fell onto its coat and froze there in tiny crystals. The wolf, with what seemed to be its last strength, lifted its head and pressed its cold nose very gently against her cheek. "This is Ashen. He is one of the king's own. The king sent him out 2 months ago with a piece of cloth that smelled of you and a single instruction. Find her. Do not be seen. He was attacked 4 nights ago by riders also looking for you. He fought free. He has been crawling the last half-mile, on 3 legs. The mark on her hip pulsed. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 months, she let herself feel, deliberately, the great searching presence on the other side of the bond. It was there. It had always been there. It had never left her. It was thin with exhaustion and shaking with grief, and absolutely, unmistakably, hers. He is alive, she breathed. He is alive, and he is coming. He will not be more than a day behind me. I rode ahead because the wolf was dying and the king has been riding without sleep, and I was afraid he would arrive in this village like a storm and frighten you into running again. Halric pressed his weathered palm flat against his heart. I came to ask you, Lady Yvain, only this. When he arrives, will you let him speak? I do not know, she whispered. Halric, I do not know what I will do. Then that is enough for today. That is more than I came hoping for. He rose stiffly. He looked once toward the western sky and then back down at her with something in his face that was almost a smile. You have his child in you. Children, perhaps? Halric's amber eyes widened. For a long moment he did not speak. And then the old man, who had served 3 alpha kings, who had buried 2 of them, lowered his head and pressed one weathered hand over his eyes, and Yvain watched his shoulders shake just once, very softly, before he gathered himself again. Then you must heal that wolf. He will need to ride beside you when you go home. He turned to walk away down the orchard path. He had not gone 20 paces when he stopped, turned back, and lifted his head as if scenting the air. A new sound had reached them. Far off, beyond the orchard, beyond the river, beyond the slate roofs of Ash Hollow, came the faint, unmistakable thunder of many hooves, a column moving fast. Halric's face went very still. That is not the king. Then who? She moved faster than we thought. His voice was the voice of a beta who had outlived 2 kings, his hand already at the hilt of the long knife beneath his coat. Get up, child. Pick up that wolf and follow me. Do not, for any reason, look back. Yvain moved. She slid one arm beneath the wolf's shoulders and one beneath his hindquarters. He weighed as much as a grown man, and the great curve of her belly made every motion an awkward miracle of balance. I have you, she whispered into his fur. Hold on. Halric was already moving, faster than a man his age had any right to move, the long knife out of his coat and held low along his thigh. How far to the cottage? A 1/4 mile. Is there a cellar? A root cellar. Will you fit through the door with the wolf? I will make myself fit. The hoofbeats grew louder. Whoever was riding had crossed the stone bridge into Ash Hollow. How many? 12, perhaps 14. Some are wolves, some are not. There are men in that company who do not change shape. Human assassins. Harder to track by scent. The cottage came into sight through the bare apple trees. Halric reached the door before her and threw it open. Inside, cellar. Now. She knelt, set Ashen down on the rag rug, and reached for the iron ring set into the floorboards. The cellar door came up with a creak. Cold, earth-smelling air rose from the dark below. Take the wolf down. Take the journal. She froze for a half-second. How do you know about the journal? Later, child. Move. She lowered Ashen down the steep wooden steps as gently as she could, half sliding, and laid him on the dirt floor beside the rack of stored apples. She took the stairs back up 2 at a time, swept a dozen herb bottles into her satchel, and pulled her grandmother's journal in its oilcloth wrap from beneath the loose floorboard under the cot. Halric had bolted the cottage door and was pushing the heavy oak chest in front of it. How much time? Less than a minute. The hoofbeats were close now. She heard a shouted command, the wet ring of a blade being drawn from a leather scabbard. The soft, terrible voice of a woman raised to carry over the cold air. Healer. Yvain's blood stopped. It was not the woman from the war chamber. It was younger, lighter. There was almost a smile in it. Healer, I know you are inside. I know the old wolf is with you. We have no quarrel with the village. We only want the wolf. Halrick's eyes flicked to hers. He shook his head once. Cellar, he mouthed. She backed toward the cellar door. He did not follow. Halrick, I will hold the door. Halrick, no. I have served the Dreventh line for 41 years. I will not have it said that I died in a chair. The old man pressed his weathered hand briefly against her cheek. Go down. Bar it from inside. Do not, for any reason, come up until you hear the king's voice. A heavy fist struck the cottage door. The whole frame shook. Halrick turned away from her and lifted his long knife. Yvain, with one terrible last look at the back of the old man who had ridden 3 days through frozen country to find her, lowered herself down the cellar stairs and pulled the trapdoor shut over her head and slid the iron bolt home with a soft, final click. The dark closed around her. Ashen whined softly. Yvain knelt beside him, pressed her hand against his wounded flank, and closed her eyes. She did not have her grandmother's gift. Not the way her grandmother had spoken of in the journal. She had only the small healer's craft taught by every wise woman in every village in every kingdom. She had told herself that all her life. She had refused to believe in anything more, even when the mark on her hip burned like a star, even when the bond had searched for her across 300 miles of frozen country. She looked at it now. There was no time left for refusing. Above her, the cottage door splintered inward, the crash of the oak chest being shoved aside. Halrick's voice, calm and unsurprised, speaking in a language she did not know. Old words, formal words, the words of a beta declaring himself before combat. Then the clean, terrible sound of his long knife meeting another blade, and another, and a third. She pressed both hands against the wolf's wounded flank. Stay with me. Your king is coming. Stay with me until he comes. In the dark of the cellar, beneath the sound of an old man fighting alone for her life 1 floor above, Yvain of Caer Draventh closed her eyes and let the thing she had refused to look at all her life rise quietly, deliberately, like a hand lifting from beneath still water. Her palms began to warm, then to glow. A soft, silver light spilled out from beneath her fingers, faint as moonlight on snow. The wound under her hands began slowly to close. The trapdoor splintered. A boot punched through. A second boot. A gloved hand reached down through the broken wood and felt for the bolt. The light around her hands rose suddenly, like a flame catching wind. It filled the cellar. It poured up through the broken trapdoor in a great pale column. A young woman's face appeared at the broken edge, pretty, even. Hair the color of wheat in late summer tied back in a soldier's tail. Eyes a pale, almost colorless gray. She was smiling. Hello, herb girl. Then the light reached her. She had only the time to draw in one short, surprised breath before she fell back from the trapdoor with a small, startled cry that was not quite pain. Yvain heard her body strike the kitchen floorboards above. A confused shout. A man's voice calling out a name. Ravel. Ravel, get up. The woman did not get up. Ashen rose to his feet. The terrible wound along his flank had closed into a long, pale scar. A man stood at the broken trapdoor, tall, lean, dressed in black, his face mostly hidden by a leather half-mask shaped like a hawk's lower beak. A short crossbow in his hands. Swar, the bolt already knocked. Climb out, healer, climb out, and we will leave the village standing. The old man bleeding on your kitchen floor will live long enough to ride home with you. Yvain's eyes flicked toward the back of the cellar. There, behind the rack of stored apples, was the small crawl tunnel that connected her root cellar to the abandoned cottage next door. She had discovered it her first month in Ash Hollow. It was barely wide enough for a child. It was certainly not wide enough for a heavily pregnant woman and a full-grown wolf. It would have to be wide enough. "All right," she called up, making her voice tremble. "Please. The wolf has my dress in his teeth. I cannot get free of him without being bitten." A pause. A soft snort of contempt. "Wolves. Make it quick." She turned. She knelt beside Ashen. "Tunnel, behind the apples. Crawl. I will follow." The wolf understood her. He moved past her in a low, silent flow of silver fur and squeezed himself into the narrow crawl space, and within 3 seconds his hindquarters had vanished into the dark. Yvain moved. The great curve of her belly dragged across the dirt floor. The earthen ceiling scraped her back. She felt her child kick once, hard, in protest, and she whispered, "I know, my love. I know," and kept crawling. Behind her she heard the man with the crossbow shout an oath, jump down into the cellar, and swear again more violently when he saw the back of her boots disappearing into the tunnel. The bolt thudded into the dirt 3 inches from her left foot. She kept crawling. She came out, gasping, into the cold dim of the neighboring cottage's root cellar. Ashen was already there, waiting. He pulled her up by the back of her cloak, gently, with his teeth closed around the wool. And she staggered up the rotted wooden steps and shoved open the trapdoor with her shoulder, tumbling out into the kitchen of the abandoned cottage. She climbed through the kitchen window and fell heavily into the snow on the other side, biting back a cry. Ashen leapt through after her and pressed his great silver shoulder against her hip to steady her. "The forest. Come on." They ran, across the back garden, over the low stone wall, into the bare winter trees of the orchard's far edge and beyond, into the deeper, older forest. A horn sounded behind her. 3 short notes, a recall signal. She ran until she could not run. She came to a stop, finally, in a small hollow at the foot of an enormous fallen oak. Ashen turned in a tight circle and lay down across her legs, his great body shielding her from the wind. Through a gap in the trees behind her, a column of black smoke had begun to rise above the slate roofs of Ash Hollow. The horns sounded again. Screams. Goodwife Penn's voice, perhaps, raised in fury rather than fear. Yvain pressed her face against the wolf's fur and wept. She wept for Halric, who would not be in the kitchen of her cottage when help arrived. She wept for the village that had sheltered her under a false name. She wept for the 3 months she had spent hating a man who had not deserved her hatred. Then, very quietly, very deliberately, she drew in a long breath and closed her eyes and reached, for the first time in 3 months, deliberately, fully, with her whole heart, across the bond. Kaloran. She felt him hear her. Far away, somewhere on a road riding hard through frozen country, she felt a great, exhausted body stop in mid-stride. She felt a heart she had thought she would never feel again hit her own with a single huge beat. She felt the bond, the terrible and beautiful bond she had been refusing, snap fully open between them like a banner unfurling in a wind, and through it she felt his voice come back to her, ragged and stunned and breaking. A single word, a single name, hers. Yvain. She pressed her forehead to the wolf's shoulder. "Hurry, my love, please, hurry." He came at dusk. Yvain had not moved from the shelter of the fallen oak. The light in the forest had shifted from the thin silver of late afternoon to the deep blue of a winter twilight, and the snow had begun, again, to fall. Her hands had gone numb at the fingertips. Her child had stopped kicking some time ago, and she had pressed her palm against her belly and felt the small, steady answer of life beneath her skin, and told herself, over and over, that the stillness was only sleep. She heard him before she saw him. It was not a sound, exactly. It was the absence of sound. The forest, which had been full of the small, ordinary noises of a winter evening, went all at once very quiet. The crow stopped calling. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. Ashen lifted his great silver head from her lap. His pale eyes fixed on a point somewhere up the slope of the hollow. His tail, very slowly, began to move. Yvain sat up. The mark on her hip flared bright and steady, a rhythm that matched another rhythm she could feel through the bond, the heavy, exhausted heartbeat of a creature that had not stopped running for 2 days. "Ashen," she whispered. The wolf turned to look at her. He pressed his cold nose once against her cheek, as if in farewell, and then rose and trotted up the slope into the deepening blue. She could not see what he met there. She heard a low whining sound. She heard a deeper sound answer. After a long pause, she heard the slow, careful crunch of footsteps in snow coming down toward her. She sat in the snow with her back against the fallen oak, her hands pressed flat against her belly, her breath shallow in her throat, and she watched the long shadow at the top of the hollow resolve itself into the shape of a man. He came down the slope alone. He had been a wolf only a moment before. She knew it without needing to be told. The silver edges of the change were still on him. He had shifted to come to her on 2 legs, because he had known that she could not bear to be found by an animal. He wore only a rough wool cloak thrown loose around his shoulders and a pair of deerskin breeches. His feet were bare in the snow. His dark hair was longer than she had ever seen it. There was a hollowness in his cheeks that had not been there 3 months ago. His eyes were the same. They were the eyes she had seen across the herb garden on a summer morning 2 years past. They were the eyes of the man she had spent 3 months teaching herself not to love, and they were full of so much exhausted, helpless, animal fear that she heard her own breath catch. He stopped 6 paces from her. He did not come closer. He sank down slowly until he was kneeling in the snow. "Yvain." His voice was a wreck. The voice of a man who had been screaming her name for months and had only now remembered how to shape it into a quiet thing. She did not speak. She did not yet know what she would say. He did not reach for her. The bond between them was wide open now, and she could feel everything he felt, and he could feel everything she felt, and there was nowhere for either of them to hide. She felt his terror, his shame, the long, brutal, sleepless months of his search. She felt his love, the great, raw, unguarded thing he had spent his whole life trying to hold quietly, because the world used such things against an alpha king. He bowed his head. "I am sorry," he said. The words splintered. "Yvain, there is no word for what I have done to you." She closed her eyes. She had, somewhere in the last 3 months, prepared 1,000 things to say to him if she ever saw him again. She had practiced fury. She had practiced cold dignity. She could not now remember a single one of the speeches. "You said I would never leave you." "I know." "You said it as though I were a thing you owned." "I know." "You did not even sound like a man who knew my name." "I know," he said again, and his voice cracked. "Yvain, I knew, the moment you ran, that I had done it wrong. I knew while I was speaking the words. I have known every hour of every day since." The snow drifted down between them. "Halric told me what was happening in that room." "Halric is dead." The words struck her like a blow. She made a small, broken sound. She had known. She had known from the moment she had heard the splintering of her cottage door. To hear Cailerin himself name it was a different thing. "He held the door for me. He held it longer than any man could have. I felt him die. I rode the last hour as a wolf because no horse alive could have carried me fast enough. The riders? Some are dead. Some are running. The ones who burned the village, my men have pinned against the river. Goodwife Penn lives. The miller lives. They fought Yvain. They fought for the healer at the edge of the orchard. They did not know who you were. They fought for you anyway." She covered her face with her hands and wept hard, the great heaving sobs of a woman who had been holding too much for too long. He waited until her weeping had passed, and then he said, very gently, "Yvain, may I come closer?" She lowered her hands. "Yes." He came to her on his knees. He crossed those 6 paces of snow on his knees, the way a man crosses the floor of a temple toward something he is not yet sure he is permitted to touch. When he reached her, he lifted his hands, slowly, and held them just above her shoulders, hovering, asking, and she gave him the smallest possible nod. He gathered her, then, against his chest. She felt him shake. She felt him press his face into her hair and breathe in, as if no amount of breathing would ever be enough again. She felt his hand come down, tentative, terrified, and rest against the great curve of her belly. She felt his breath catch when, beneath his palm, their child shifted, sleepy and warm, and pressed once against his hand from inside her. He made a sound she would never, for the rest of her life, be able to describe. "There are two," she whispered into his shoulder. "Halric thinks. So does Goodwife Penn. Two." The word came out like a prayer. "Yvain. Two." "I did not want to come back to you," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. "Even after Halric told me, I had built a life. I had built it out of pieces of myself I had to break to make it fit." He pulled back, just enough to look at her face. "Then you will not come home," he said quietly. "Not yet. Not because I have asked. You will come home, if you come home, because you have decided to. I will not take you back to Caer Draventh as a thing I have recovered. I would rather lose you again. A cottage on the coast, if you want it. A place at my side as my queen if you will have it. And a place 1,000 miles from me if you will not. I have come here to put the choice back into your hands where it always belonged." She felt the bond between them, wide and deep and humming. She felt his exhausted body. She felt the small, soft kicks of their children. She felt the slow, strange knowledge that she had somehow, against every sane expectation, come home. "Take me to your camp," she said finally. "Take me to a fire. Feed me something hot. Let me sleep one night beside you without deciding anything." She paused. "And in the morning, my love, we will speak about the rest." His arms tightened around her. He pressed his lips, very gently, to the crown of her head. "Yes, Yvain. Yes." He lifted her then, as if she weighed nothing, and carried her up the slope of the hollow into the gathering dark. Ashen fell in at his heel. Behind them, the snow began, gently, to cover their tracks. The camp was small. He had ridden ahead of his guard. There were only 6 men with him, and Ashen, and a single bay horse so exhausted she stood with her head almost touching the snow. The men had built a fire in the lee of a low rock face beside a fast green river, and when Caelorin came down out of the trees with Yvain in his arms, every one of those 6 men dropped to one knee in the snow without a word. "They knew," she whispered. "They have known for a long time. They have only waited for me to be brave enough to say it." He set her down beside the fire. He did not let go of her hand. There was hot broth in an iron pot. There was bread. A young beta with a kind, tired face draped a thick wool blanket around her shoulders without quite meeting her eyes. She ate. She had not realized how hungry she was. When she had finished, the young beta refilled the cup and pressed it into her hands. "My lady." "What is your name?" "Teriel, my lady." "Teriel. Thank you." He bowed his head and did not move from her side. She understood slowly that he had been given a duty, and the duty was her, and she was not going to be alone in any room with any door for a long time to come. She let it happen. She was too tired to argue with kindness. Caelorin sat beside her on a folded saddle blanket. He was watching her, not in the way a man watches a thing he means to keep, but in the way a man watches a candle in a great wind, ready to cup his hands around it the moment it flickers. "Tell me." So she told him. She told him everything. The corridor, the silver tray, the sound of the woman's voice through the war chamber door. The tea she had stirred into Bren's flask. The long, cold night of walking. The road south. Goodwife Penn, and the cottage at the edge of the orchard. The first baby she had delivered in Ash Hollow. A girl, born screaming on a snowy night in the 3rd week of her exile. She told him about the mark on her hip, and how it had never faded. She told him about the dreams. He went very still at that. Dreams? I did not understand them. I thought my own mind was building you every night. I thought it was grief. He set down his cup. Yvain, those were not your dreams. Those were mine. She stared at him. I went to you, every night. In my sleep. I did not know I was doing it for the first month. I would wake at dawn with my mouth tasting of words I had not said in waking hours. Halric was the one who told me, "My king, your wolf is walking the bond at night." I did not believe him until I started to remember pieces of it. The shape of the cottage where you slept. A wooden spoon a child had carved you. A blue cup on a windowsill. Her hand flew to her mouth. There is a blue cup on the windowsill. The blacksmith's apprentice gave it to me. I know. I told you in those dreams, every night, the truth of what had happened. I begged you every night to hear me. I did not know if you ever did. I heard you, she whispered. I told myself it was not real. I was so afraid of hoping. He reached, slowly, and pressed her palm against his chest, over the steady drum of his heart. It has not stopped beating since the first night I dreamed of you. Every night I have walked the bond. Every night I have whispered to you that you were loved, that you had been lied for and not lied to, that I was coming. She lifted her other hand and pressed it over his, on her belly, and through both joined hands she felt their child kick once, twice, 3 times, in answer. They have been listening. His face broke into the first real smile she had seen on it since he had come down out of the trees. Of course they have. He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed the inside of her wrist, very softly, and set her hand back gently in her lap. Sleep first. Talk first. Decisions later. She leaned against his shoulder and let her eyes close, and she slept beside the fire of her king's camp for the first time in 3 months without needing to listen for hoofbeats on the road. She did not see the rider come in. She did not see him dismount 3 lengths from the fire and go to one knee, pressing his fist to his heart and speaking quietly to Cailerin in the low-coded speech of a courier who has ridden too hard with bad news. She did not see Cailerin's face go still, or the way he rose and crossed to the edge of the camp and stood for a long moment looking north into the dark. She slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a woman whose body had given everything it had to give, and who had finally, after 3 months of running, come home. Dawn came gray. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and pine. Her belly was a great heavy roundness in her lap, and her children were already kicking. The fire had been built up. A fresh iron kettle steamed on a hook. Cailerin was sitting opposite her across the fire. He had not slept. She could see it in the deep shadow under his eyes, in the tight set of his mouth, in the way he was holding a cup of something hot in both hands as though the warmth might keep his fingers from shaking. He looked up when she stirred. He tried, immediately, to put on a face for her. Don't. He stopped. The careful expression dropped from his face. Tell me. He told her. He told her about the courier, about the city of Highmoor, where the king's southern fleet had been moored for the winter, taken in a single night by ships that had flown false colors. About the road north into Caer Draventh, held for a week by a captain named Sarek who had been Halric's nephew, and who had been quietly bought, and who had opened the inner gate to a column of 200 riders in the small hours of a moonless morning. About his sister, the Lady Merith, whom he had left in command of the household, who had escaped through a sally port with 20 of her women and 3 of his ministers and 1 of his crowns, riding hard for the old fortress at Stonewatch with 200 enemy riders perhaps a day behind her. He told her that the woman in the war chamber, who had called herself by a borrowed name, was in truth a woman called Vesna of the Raven's Reach, sister to a man Yvain had never heard of, who was now claiming, by right of conquest, to be the new lord of Caer Draventh. She sat in his chair on his dais wearing his great silver cloak. He told her that the kingdom believed him dead. She listened. She did not weep. She did not cry out. She only listened, with both hands on her great belly and her face very still. What did Halric think of her? She said, when she came that night. Calorin drew in a slow breath. He thought she was not a scout. He thought she was a queen. He thought she had not come to threaten me. She had come to take my measure. He thought she would either marry me or kill me, and that whichever she did, she would sit in my chair within the year. I did not believe him. I thought him paranoid. I thought him old. His voice cracked. I have been wrong about every single thing that mattered for 3 months running. Yvain was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. Then the kingdom does not need a king who is sure he is right. The kingdom needs a king who has been wrong, and who has come back from being wrong. You will make a better king for what has happened, and I will make a better queen, my love, for what has happened to me. His eyes filled. You will be my queen then. I have been your queen for 2 years. I have only been afraid to say it aloud. He came around the fire on his knees. He took her hands in his. There is no castle to take you to. There is no throne to seat you on. There is a fortress in the mountains, perhaps, if my sister reaches it. There is an army still loyal to the Draventh line, scattered through 3 provinces. There is a kingdom that will have to be won back inch by the kind of slow, patient war that breaks men before it breaks countries. Then we will break it together. I have been broken before, my king. I have learned that the pieces are still useful. He laughed, a wrecked, astonished sound. He lifted his face to look at her, and the morning light caught the wet of his eyes, and she lifted one hand and laid it against the line of his jaw. And she kissed him. Finally, for the first time in 3 months, in the gray dawn of a forest camp in country that was no longer his, the bond between them sang. She felt his whole self pour into her, and herself pour into him in return. She felt, somewhere in the slow opening of the bond, a thread that ran not just to him, but through him, to something older, to her grandmother, to the long, quiet line of women whose blood she carried. She drew back from the kiss. Calorin, there is something in my grandmother's journal. He went still. My mother told me, on the day I left for the castle, that there were things in that book the Alphas would burn the world to find. I have had 3 months to read it. What is it? There are old wolves, she said slowly. Older than the Draventh line. Older than any of the great houses. Before the kingdoms were drawn, there were mothers of bloodlines who could call wolves to them. Not by alpha command. By an older bond. The mothers were hunted. Killed, every one of them, in a long, quiet war that no history book remembers because the men who wrote the histories were the men who killed them. The lines were thought to be ended. Yvain. My grandmother was a daughter of the last of those mothers. I healed Ashen with my hands. Not with herbs. With my hands. I drove a woman back from a trapdoor without touching her, with light that came out of me. I have known since yesterday that I am not what I thought I was. I have known since this morning what to do with it. She lifted her face to his. I can call wolves to me, Calorin. Not your wolves. The unbonded ones. The ones the histories say have gone wild, gone north into the forests where no alpha has gone in 300 years. There are thousands of them. They have been waiting for someone to call. He stared at her for a long time. You would call them. I would call them because my king has lost his throne to a woman who thought she could threaten our child and call it diplomacy. I would call them because Halric is dead. I am tired of running. I think I am done. He pressed his face into her hands. She felt him weep, and laugh, and weep again. Then call them, my queen. Call them, and we will go and take back our home. She rose, slowly, with his help. She walked to the edge of the camp, with one of his arms around her waist and Ashen pacing beside her, to the top of a low rise where the forest fell away into a long white valley below. She closed her eyes. She opened the place beneath her ribs where the silver light had risen in the cellar. She let it rise again. Higher. Wider. Not a column this time, but a great quiet wave, spreading outward, rolling down into the white valley, rolling on past the river, rolling on into the forests beyond. She made of herself a single quiet word. The word was come. For a long moment, nothing. Then, far away, somewhere deep in the forests on the far side of the white valley, a wolf howled. It was answered after a moment by another, from a different direction, and then by another, much closer. And then the forest, in every direction, as far as her ear could reach, began to sing. Yvain opened her eyes. She turned her face up to the silver sky and laughed. Once, the helpless, astonished laugh of a woman who had finally heard, after all the long silence of her life, the sound of her own grandmother's voice answering her at last. "My queen," Calorin whispered. "My king." And in the forests below, from every direction at once, the wolves began to come. The march on Caer Draventh was not a march. It was a tide. They came north along the old roads and through the deep forest passes that no army had used in 200 years. They came in ones and twos at first, then in tens, then in hundreds. They came on 4 legs and on 2. The wolves Yvain had called moved alongside Calorin's riders without any of the snarling territorial wariness that should have made such a thing impossible. They were joined, on the 3rd day, by the Lady Marith. Calorin's sister came down out of the mountain pass with what was left of her household, 20 women and 3 ministers and 140 riders. She had never reached Stonewatch. Her pursuers had caught her in the high passes, and she had broken them at a place called the Hawk's Throat in a long, bloody night fight, and turned south to find her brother instead. She rode into camp with a sword across her saddle and a cut above her eye, dismounted, crossed to Yvain without a word, and went to one knee in the mud. "My queen." "My sister," Yvain answered and lifted her up. They were joined, on the 5th day, by the surviving men of the Southern Fleet, who had taken back 2 of their own ships in a harbor brawl and ridden inland with 300 sailors who had decided, against all sense, that they preferred a beaten king to a foreign one. They were joined, on the 7th day, by the people of Ash Hollow. That was the moment Yvain wept. They came up the road in a long, quiet column, perhaps 80 of them, the miller and the blacksmith and the weaver and goodwife Pen at their head with a long oak staff in her hand. They had brought their own provisions and their own blankets and their own small ragged weapons, and goodwife Pen looked Yvain in the eye across the camp and said, "You did not tell us, child, that you were a queen. We forgive you. Now feed us, and tell us where to stand." By the 9th day, the army that came up the long road toward the high black towers of Caer Draventh was an army of nearly 4,000. Vesna of the Raven's Reach met them in the field. She came out of the castle gate with what she had, perhaps 3,000 of her own riders and the remains of the bought guard, and a long rank of mounted archers along her left flank. And she drew up her line on the great open plain south of the castle, and she sat at the head of it on a tall white horse, and she waited. She wore Calorin's silver cloak. Yvain saw her from a long way off, a small figure in silver on a white horse at the head of an enemy line, and she felt the old fear rise in her, the fear of the voice through the war chamber door. And she let the fear come, and she let it pass through her, and she let it go. She did not need it anymore. She rode at Calorin's side, on a quiet brown mare chosen for her gentleness, with Ashen pacing at her stirrup, and her belly so great now that no saddle quite fit her properly. She wore a plain wool cloak, and a circlet of beaten silver that the Lady Marith had pressed into her hands the night before, with the words, "It was our mother's." Vesna sent a herald. "She wishes to speak with the king," Alone, in the center of the field, she offers terms. Kailoren's jaw tightened. She offers nothing. She wishes to put a knife in me where my own line cannot reach. I will go with you, Yvain said. He turned in his saddle. Yvain, no. She came to that war chamber to take my measure, my love. It is past time I took hers. He looked at her for a long moment. He did not argue. They rode out together. Ashen came with them. Vesna rode out from her own line with 2 riders at her flank, and when she saw Ashen and the heavily pregnant woman riding at the king's side, her face changed for a fraction of a second. She had not known. She recovered fast. She stopped her white horse 3 lengths from theirs. Alpha King, Vesna of the Raven's Reach, and the herb girl. Vesna's pale eyes flicked to Yvain. The old smile was there. The smile from behind the war chamber door. How brave of you to come out into the open. I had thought you were the running sort. I was, Yvain said evenly. I have decided to be otherwise. My terms are simple. Withdraw, take your woman and your wolves, and your absurd little farmer army and go south, into exile. The Dreventh line will end with your generation, but it will end in beds, not on swords. Refuse, and by sundown your sister will be hanging from the south wall, and your queen will be in my keeping, and you will be made to watch what I do with her. The bond between Yvain and Kailoren went very still. It was Yvain who spoke. Vesna, I am going to give you now the only chance you will be given. Get off the horse. Go to your knees. Speak my husband's name as your king. He is a more merciful man than I am, and he will let you live. Vesna laughed. Or what, herb girl? You will heal me to death. Yvain smiled. She lifted slowly her right hand. The silver light, which had been quiet beneath her ribs all morning, rose. It collected on her open palm, the way sunlight collects on a still pond. A small silver flame. A thing like a held breath. Vesna's pale eyes widened. You are not. The mothers are dead. The mothers were ended. The mothers are riding behind me, 3,000 wolves with teeth. Off the horse, Vesna, last warning. Vesna of the Raven's Reach was a clever woman. She had not survived this long by being slow. She drew the long, thin blade at her hip and put her heels to her horse and came at Kailoren in a single white blur, because she had understood, in the half-second after Yvain spoke, that the woman beside the king was not a thing she could break, and the only piece of him she could still reach was his throat. The blade never landed. Ashen took her from the saddle. The great silver wolf came up off the ground in one long, uncoiling spring, and his jaws closed on the wrist of Vesna's sword arm, and the white horse bolted out from under her, and Vesna of the Raven's Reach hit the half-frozen mud of the field on her back, with a wolf the size of a small horse standing astride her. Ashen did not kill her. He looked instead at Yvain, waiting. Spare her. The whole field went quiet. Spare her, take her sword, take her cloak. That is my husband's cloak, and I will have it back. Take her into the keeping of the Lady Marith, and put her in a cell in the lowest part of Caer Dreventh, and feed her, and do not touch her, and bring her before me 1 year from today. I will not rule a kingdom whose queens were killed by other queens. I will rule a kingdom whose queens learned, in the dark of a long year, to be sorry. Kailoren looked at her. His eyes were full. Aye, as my queen wills it. The army behind them, without anyone giving the order, raised a single great cheer. The line across the field, looking at the sight of their general on her back beneath a wolf, broke. Some ran. Some dropped their weapons and went to their knees in the mud. By midday, Caer Dreventh was open. By dusk, Kailoren Dreventh rode through his own gate again, with his queen at his side and his wolf at his stirrup, and the people of his city, who had endured 10 days of a stranger in his chair, lined the streets and wept. Yvain wept with them. She wept for Halric, who was not there. She wept for old Bren the gate warden, who came out of the gatehouse with his white head bowed, who had woken from her sleeping draught on the morning she had fled, and had sat in a cell for the 10 days of Vesna's rule, because he had refused to swear oath to a stranger. She wept for the children inside her, who would be born in a castle with their father in the chair he was meant to sit in. And Caelorin Draventh, the alpha king of a kingdom he had nearly lost, turned in his saddle and lifted her down from her mare onto his own, and held her against his chest in the gateway of his own castle while his people roared, and she pressed her wet face into his cloak and let herself finally come home. They were married in the old way 3 nights later. There was no time to wait. Goodwife Pen herself, summoned to the bedchamber Yvain now shared with the king, had pressed her hand against the great curve of her belly and said, "Within the week, child, no later." So they wed in haste, by torchlight, in the great hall of Caer Draventh. She wore a gown the color of new snow, and a circlet of beaten silver, and the obsidian pendant he had given her 2 years before. She walked into the hall on her own 2 feet because she had refused, very firmly, to be carried. The Lady Merith stood at the right of the dais. Teriel, who had been promoted to the king's first beta in the days after Halric's death, stood at the left. Goodwife Pen of Ash Hollow sat in the front row of witnesses, in a new wool dress someone had pressed on her, and wept the entire ceremony without making any apology for it. The vows were spoken twice. Once in the human tongue, before the assembled lords and ladies of a kingdom that had nearly been lost. Once in the older tongue, the one that lives only in the bond between a true mate and her chosen wolf. Yvain had not known the words. They had risen out of her, the way the silver light rose, the way the call to the wolves had risen. She bit him. He bit her. The bond, which had been wide open between them for weeks, sealed itself shut, and made of 2 creatures, 1 creature, and the children inside her kicked once, in unison, and Caelorin Draventh, the Alpha King, pressed his forehead to hers and wept openly in front of every lord of his realm. The children were born 5 nights later. A boy. A girl. The boy had his father's dark hair and his mother's grandmother's silver eyes. The girl had her mother's chestnut hair and her father's amber eyes. And when she was 3 days old, she opened those amber eyes and they flared briefly silver, and Yvain pressed her face into the small warm bundle of her daughter and laughed, a laugh that was half a sob, and said, "Hello, little mother. We have been waiting for you." The kingdom healed slowly, over the long winter and into the new spring. Vesna of the Raven's Reach was held, as Yvain had ordered, for a year. When the year was done, she was brought up out of the lower cells into a small private chamber, and Yvain sat with her there for an entire afternoon, alone, with the door closed. No one in the castle ever afterward learned what was said between them. But Vesna wept, by the report of the guard who took her down again. And a year after that, she went to her knees and spoke Caelorin's name as her king, and was given a small holding on the northern border, and a slow, patient work of repair to do for the rest of her days. Halric was buried in the spring after the taking back, beneath a young oak on the rise above the river where Yvain had called the wolves. Caelorin set the stone himself. Yvain planted herbs around it, thyme and rosemary, and a small, stubborn patch of valerian root, the same blend she had been carrying on a silver tray on the night her old life had ended. She visited the grave every year, on the anniversary of the night she had run. On the first morning after their first child's first birthday, she woke before dawn. Caelorin was still asleep beside her, his dark head against her shoulder, his arm heavy across her waist. The fire in the great chamber's hearth had burned low. Snow was falling outside the high windows. The same patient, indifferent snow that had fallen on the night she had walked out the postern gate of this castle a lifetime ago, with a satchel on her hip, and a bond mark on her thigh, and a head full of 3 flat words, "She will never leave me." She lay very still in the warm bed. She thought of the woman she had been on that night, of how absolutely she had known what those 3 words meant, of how she had carried that certainty out into the snow and built a whole new life on its foundation. She thought of how wrong she had been. She thought of how grateful she was to have been wrong. She turned her face, very gently, and pressed her lips to the top of her king's dark head. He stirred. He did not wake. His arm tightened around her waist in the unconscious certainty of a man who, even sleeping, knew exactly where his queen was. Outside the high windows, the first gray light of morning began to come up over Caer Drevent. Yvain closed her eyes and listened to the steady drum of his heart against her ribs, and to the small breathing of 2 children in 2 cradles in the next room, and to the distant low song of the wolves of the hills greeting the snow. She had heard once the wrong words spoken behind a closed door. She had run. She had been wrong to run, and she had been right to run, and the woman she had become in the running had been the woman who had walked back through the gate of this castle with an army at her back and a wolf at her side. She had not left him. He had not let her go. The bond between them sang quietly in the dawn, and the snow fell, and the kingdom lived. Outside, somewhere above the snow, a single wolf howled. It was answered after a moment by another, and then by another, and then by a whole chorus, ringing across the cold winter hills, the old voices and the new voices, the bonded and the unbonded, all singing together at the rising of a new sun over a kingdom that had, against every reasonable expectation, been put back together. Yvain smiled into the dim of the chamber. "Good morning, my loves," she whispered, and the morning, without hurrying, came in. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story.